I'm always fascinated by how some authors of novels can creatively weave together different storylines that seem to be totally unconnected. But in the end, the reader discovers how those lines all fit together. The writer of the book of Mark often used a similar literary technique by starting one story and then in the midst of that story inserting another one. One example of this is found in Mark, the 5th chapter, the 21st through the 34th verses, which I'll paraphrase. Jesus had just returned from the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee, the unclean side according to the Jews, and he's now back on the Jewish side. Still down by the boat, Jairus, a synagogue leader, comes and begs Jesus to lay his hands on his daughter because she's near death. So Jesus heads off to the house of Jairus to touch the young girl. That was his agenda. As they walked down the street, there was a woman hiding along the way, hiding because she had been plagued with chronic bleeding for 12 years. Because of that illness, she was considered unclean and not permitted to be a part of the community. She'd heard about this man Jesus and believed if she just touched him, she would be healed. So as he passed, she slipped out from her hiding place, hurried over behind him without being recognized, knelt down, and touched his robe. At that moment, she felt a change, and she knew her physical illness had been healed, but she quickly ran back to her hiding place, not wanting to be recognized. At the same moment, Jesus felt energy leave him. He turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples were a little taken back by his question, and they said, "What are you talking about, Jesus? With this crowd pushing and jostling you, you're asking, 'Who touched me?' Dozens have touched you." But Jesus continued to scan the crowd. The woman, still hiding, knew she was the one he was looking for and knew his eyes would soon fall upon her. She came out of her hiding place and shared her story with Jesus. Then Jesus told her, because she took a risk of faith, she was now healed. Now, when Jesus left the seaside, his agenda was to go to Jairus' daughter and bring healing. But his agenda, his travel along the way, was interrupted. This is one of those times when the writer of Mark sandwiches a story within a story. In this case, creating a sense of disruption and even anxiety. I can only imagine the father Jairus must have seen this as a life-threatening interruption. And the disciples must have been confused and frustrated by the interruption this woman created, and probably further frustrated that Jesus stopped and spent valuable time with this nobody person. In the cultural and religious life of that community, this woman's illness placed her in the category of unclean, untouchable. It was expected that when she walked down the street, she or others would shout out, "Unclean, unclean," warning others to stay away. Jairus was a well-respected leader in the community. The leader of the synagogue probably had considerable wealth. It would seem because of his status, his needs would come first. He was much further up the social religious food chain than this dirty woman. Jairus should come first, shouldn't he? Those with Jesus would have viewed this woman unwelcome in community, and certainly her interruption that day was not welcomed. It was a hot Sunday morning in one of our congregations in Kolwezi, Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'd been invited to be the speaker. Brother Bunda Chibwe was translating for me, and we were working together quite well. And I was working through the points of my sermon, working my agenda. And as I was preaching, I noticed near the back of the full church building, a gentleman had gotten up and was moving out toward the aisle. I didn't think much about it. There was other movement in this very large crowd, and I just somewhat ignored him. Then I noticed he began walking down the aisle toward the front. Even though I continued with my agenda, my preaching, he now had a bit more of my attention. And as he continued to walk, he was now attracting more attention from the congregation. And it was now apparent he was headed directly toward Brother Boone and me. I'm sorry to admit to you today, but the closer he came to us, the more I felt he was an interruption. When he was only a few feet from us, he collapsed right there on the floor. I looked at Brother Boone with a look that said, "You're the apostle, do something." He looked back at me with a look that said, "You're the preacher, you do something." Brother Chibway and I went over, knelt down, and we offered a prayer on this friend's behalf, not knowing anything about his life situation. Then some members came over and helped him to the back of the building. Now, I'll admit, in those moments, my concern was this huge interruption that he had created. And my mind was racing as to how I would get back on my agenda, how we would pull this service back on track. However, my self-centered thoughts of how this interrupted my agenda were later turned upside down when I discovered this man's deep personal pain. He had been wrongly accused of theft from his employer, a crime which could mean death in that culture. And because of this accusation, he was separated from his family, his community, and his church. He had been ostracized. And this was the first time he had been back to church for a long period of time. And something happened through the Holy Spirit during that worship that caused him to realize he was a person of worth in God's eyes. And he wanted to find his way back into community. And he said he just spontaneously responded to that new hope by walking down that aisle. And I initially saw this as an inconvenient interruption. This man's situation was similar to the woman who interrupted Jesus' travel and agenda. They both felt the pain of being told they were not worthy. They experienced loneliness and fear. Can you imagine walking down the street knowing you were so disliked it bordered on hate? And for the woman to know the harsh treatment she'd received was promoted and even condoned by her own religious community. Interruptions help both of them to again experience dignity and self-worth and to again be accepted back into community. Now back to the first story. Jesus continues on to the house of Jairus. When he arrives, the community mourners have already gathered and they are in full mourning mode. And Jesus asks them, "Why are you making such a commotion?" And then he says, "The child's not dead, but is sleeping." The mourners laugh at Jesus' statement. Then Jesus, acting a little bit like a bouncer, he kicks the mourners out of the house. He then takes the little girl's hand, speaks to her, and she gets up. A miracle. Amazing. Now, I don't want to take away or diminish the power of that miracle, however that might have occurred. But we could miss a very important aspect of this scene if we just focus on the miracle. If we try to wrap our minds around this with questions such as, was she really dead? Was she just sleeping? Was she in a coma? Had she just passed out from dehydration? But rather think about this question. Is the miracle the only thing that turned around this scene of despair? I would suggest this scene of despair and hopelessness was interrupted by the hope Jesus brought, with or without a miracle. The same hope He offers to each of us. The story of the woman on the street, or a friend in Kolwezi, or a family 2,000 years ago losing hope, are also the stories of many people in our culture today. Possibly the stories of some of you. Stories of people who have experienced bigotry and oppression, people who have been told they don't belong, people who are living life without any real hope. Refugees. Refugees just looking for a safe place to live, a place that might welcome them. But instead, they sometimes hear messages telling them that they don't belong. Go away. They sometimes hear messages of hate. And sometimes they are shipped around being used as pawns in political games. And what about stories today of persons trying to live life as they believe God created them to be? But there are those who see anyone different from themselves as unacceptable, somewhat unclean, as the woman in the story. And some even wrap their prejudicial rhetoric and actions of unacceptance in a religious package. But so did many on the street who saw the woman as unacceptable. In our book of Scripture, there's a warning about these kinds of packages. There are subtle yet powerful influences in the world, some even claiming to represent Christ, that seek to divide people and nations to accomplish their destructive aims. That which seeks to harden one human heart against another by constructing walls of fear and prejudice is not of God. Be especially alert to these influences, lest they divide you or divert you from the mission to which you are called. That which seeks to harden one human heart against another by constructing walls of fear and prejudice is not of God. On the street that day, there were more interruptions than just the actions of the woman. Jesus did some interrupting. He interrupted so many cultural and religious norms when he engaged with this woman, helping her to know that she was of worth and value. Jesus interrupted the concept that some are higher on the social religious ladder and deserve more. Jesus' interruptions pushed back on the belief that it's okay to treat others as unworthy with no value. Just as Jesus crossed many well-defined cultural religious lines when he engaged with the woman and touched the young girl, we too are challenged to cross lines by interrupting systems and structures which keep people hiding along our streets. We're called to reflect the love of Christ by working to break down barriers of exclusion and create space at the table for all persons. And what about the modern-day houses of Jairus? Living out the message of Christ will take us to those houses. That is, to persons who are oppressed by overwhelming situations of life. Now, we may be reluctant to engage with them for fear we have no bag of miracle solutions for them. However, friends, when we bring the hope of Jesus' love and care into those scenes of desperation and fear, for those persons, that could be the miracle. Interruptions. There are days when I think life would be so much simpler and even more pleasant without interruptions. However, the more I learn about the justice and peace Christ came to bring and the kingdom to which it leads, the more I realize the pathway to that kingdom must be filled with interruptions. Do you sometimes find yourself hiding along the streets of life? We don't have to stay hiding because of what others may have said or think, or because of choices we may have made, or because of shame or guilt. The living Christ invites us to step out into the street, meet Him, and be healed. Sometimes we may be in that hopeless scene of Jairus' house. Financial issues, broken relationships, loss of employment, passed over again for that promotion, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, we can call in the mourners, or we can let Christ interrupt our scene with His hope. And when you look out into your communities, are you and your congregation willing to be vulnerable enough and allow your agendas to be interrupted by the stories of others? Are you and your congregation willing to be the voice of interruption and engage in acts which will interrupt the bigotry, the hate, and prejudice which separates people from community? Christ's mission is our mission, and part of that mission is to be compassionate disciples of interruption.